Muy buenas tardes para quienes nos siguen desde América Latina. Muy buenas noches para quienes nos escuchan desde Europa. Continuamos con este taller de modelos autoritarios para la construcción del Estado y para ellos nos acompañan en la tarde de hoy los profesores Bálint Magyar y Bálint Magyar, que han publicado es un texto, con este texto quiero comenzar, que es de su autoría, sobre la anatomía de los regímenes postcomunistas y que realmente ha sido traducido recientemente al español y que desde ya les estoy recomendando que busquen, lean. Ha sido publicado por Hipermedia Ediciones y ha sido prologado por mi colega Armando Chaguaceda, a quien le voy a hacer el honor de presentar a nuestros profesores que sin duda repiten en este semestre con nosotros en este curso. Lo hemos tenido en el curso anterior hablando sobre transiciones en regímenes postcomunistas y hoy nos van a hablar sobre autoritarismo, pero sin más y dándole la bienvenida a los profesores Magyar y Magyar, los dejo con el doctor Armando Chaguaceda.
Well, it's a good opportunity to present to my dear fellows here with you. Bálint Magyar is not only a scholar, it's not only a global scholar. He was an opposition activist against the communist regime in Hungary a few years ago. And from this special place of the mixture of experience of activism and study the regimes is a very, very important voice to talk about this topic. Bálint Magyar is younger, but have a good experience because I've studied together with Bálint Magyar the topics of post-communist regime. Both of them have been published these books, the book of anatomy of post-communist regime, with several translations, with several idioms, several languages, in English, in French, of course, in Hungary, in Russian, and we have the Spanish version recently published by Hipermedia, and I make the introduction, the prologue. I try to say 2 or 3 important things about this today, our presentation, our moment. First, that INSTAR, Instituto Hannah Arendt, and Gobierno y Análisis Político, GAPAC, we are in an effort to share with our audience, with our civil society in Cuba, but also in Latin America, the best representation of the most innovative thinking about political regime, about authoritarianism. So it's an intellectual effort, but it's also a civic effort. This is the first thing that I like to explain. The second one is that it is possible because the solidarity of people of like Bálint Magyar and Bálint Magyar that are sharing their knowledge, but also their time with us to debate, to have a conversation about this topic. And the third issues, and I like to finish with this, and the floor is going to my fellows, is that we are making this conference, we are here right now in very special moment of the war. 2024 is not only another year of the increase of the autocratization at the war, but also is a moment in which some balance of power are in a turning point. The crisis of the invasion of Ukraine, the change in political landscape in Europe, but also in Latin America, the increase of populist regime, of authoritarian regime, are marking a turning point about the present and the future of the politics in the world, in the whole world. Then for us, it's very important to hear, to see, to receive the reflection, to receive the ideas of Bálint Malovic and Bálint Magyar. And please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. We start with the opening of the presentation. Yes. During the regime change, we had some illusions. One was, and now we should turn to the first slide. One was that after the collapse of communist regimes, there will be liberal democracies practically very easily. This illusion was fed partly by the fact that during the first years of the regime change, between 89 and 91, there was a wave of constitutional revolutions in all of the regions, and these constitutional revolutions resulted in such a situation that the newly accepted constitutions after the collapse of communist regimes resembled very much to the constitutions of the Western countries as well. The main difference was whether they were more presidential type or parliamentarian or semi-presidential settings. At that time, we thought that those regimes which are turned into new democracies, they are going. They are going from communist regimes very easily to liberal democracies. So at that time, the literature was dominated by the so-called transitology that which assumed that it's just a transitional status if some of the regimes are not communist regimes yet. But after 10 years, we had to realize that a lot of these regimes stuck into an intermediary position between liberal democracies and dictatorships. And then the different types of the regimes were summarized as hybrid regimes, and the most popular distinction between them within the frame of hybrid regimes were the electoral democracy, competitive authoritarian systems, or hegemonic authoritarian systems. But all of these approaches had two major problems. One was that they were concentrating only for the political institutions, and the other was that they used the terminology and the language for the description of these new regimes, which was used for the description of liberal democracies as well. Within these approaches, we built now mainly on János Kornai's, the well-known Hungarian economist categorization, which had the three major types between democracy, autocracy, and dictatorship. Now let's have a look at that. What is the major difference between democracies, autocracies, and dictatorships? Autocracy is somewhere between the two ends of this axis, I would say, where already it resembles to dictatorships that the government cannot be removed through peaceful or civilized procedures in these regimes, and these institutions, the guarantees for the institutions of checks and balances are really weak. But at the same time, contrary to dictatorial regimes, there is a legal parliamentary opposition. There are a lot of parties running on the elections. Even these elections are not free and not fair. In most of the cases are manipulated elections. But contrary to dictatorships, in these regimes we cannot witness a wide range of terror or physical terror and large-scale detention of different opposition politicians like in dictatorships. But we have to say that this approach has the major problems that it has three assumptions behind these categories, behind these language. Namely, the first is when they assume, even on an unconscious way, that, that in these regimes, in the post-communist regimes, the separation of spheres of social actions, the political sphere, the economic sphere, and the communal sphere, is completed. But historically, this was not the situation. Historically, the separation of these spheres of social actions was much more completed in that civilizational region of the post-communist regimes, which belong to the Western Christianity, much less in that region which belong to the Orthodox Christianity, and practically these spheres were not separated at all in those which belong to the Islamic world. And especially during the communist regimes, when they were operated after 1917 and in the other regions after the Second World War, these different spheres were merged completely. So if we want to investigate that what is the real situation in these post-communist regimes, we have to open this assumption, this axiom, and to have a look at what happens when these spheres are not separated, which means that the relation between them is not formalized and not transparent. The second such assumption was that the de jure position of persons and institutions necessarily coincide with their de facto positions. In a Western society, if we use, for example, the term entrepreneur, it means that we mean such a person who disposes over his property freely and in an autonomous way. But in the post-communist regimes, in a lot of these countries, it's not the case. Formally, you can be an entrepreneur, but at the same time, another person is who disposes over your property, which is formally under your name. So this is why, for example, we made a separation, and we do not use necessarily the term that politician and entrepreneur, or when these spheres are separated, the political sphere and the economic sphere, but instead of these oligarchs, oligarch is such a person who has a former political power but an informal economic one, and on the other hand, oligarch who has a formal economic power and an informal political one. And the third such an assumption or axiom is that the state is such an actor which pursues the common good necessarily, and of course you can witness minor mistakes in public policy issues or corruption in the system, but these are just deviances in the systems and not a system constituting elements. But what happens when the state, as an entity, just pursues a private interest and private goods? And such a way we had to extend our model, and instead of an axis, to create a triangle and to try to position the post-communist regimes within this. And the most important thing in this shape, that we double the categories of democracy, autocracy, and dictatorship. We made a distinction between liberal democracy and patronal democracy, in which case patronal democracy means such that these are such regimes where different patron-client networks are fighting and rivaling each other, but none of these patron-client networks are in the position that they could subjugate or eliminate or discriminate the other patron-client networks. Similarly, for example, in the case of autocracy, where in a conservative autocracy we can witness the monopolization of political power, but at the same time the patronalization of other spheres of the society, economy, culture, local governments, etc., does not happen. In the case of patron autocracy, we speak about such a system where it's a single patron-client network in a single power pyramid creates and gets a monopoly of political power, and with this monopoly of political power, they practically liquidate or subjugate the rival patron-client networks. And in the case of dictatorship, when we make a difference between communist dictatorship and market exploiting dictatorship, it means that while the communist dictatorship can be characterized with the monopoly of political power, one-party system on one hand, on the other hand, the monopoly and dominance of state ownership. Contrary to this, in a market exploiting dictatorship, we can witness a one-party system like in China, but at the same time, there are multiple forms of properties in the economy prevailing together at the same way. So now the question is that we have to put on the question that who is the main actor, or how can we define the ruling elite in these regimes? And when they try to define this, most of the analysts are turning back to old categories, just using a prefix of neo. So sometimes they say that the form of the new ruling elite is a neo-feudal order, for example, when they because they think that it resembles very much to patron-client relations. But contrary to the feudal orders, which were at that time legal and legitimate formations, and the relation between the different orders in the society was contractual and regulated, it's not the case in these post-communist countries. The patron-client networks and the types of different vassal ties between the members or groups of the society, they are illegitimate one. We can say that it's also not a neo-nomenclatura, because the nomenclatura during the communist times, it was a kind of register cataster of positions within the society, parallelly together two types of nomenclaturas, the party nomenclatura and the non-party nomenclatura, where in these positions individuals were recruited and put there in a kind of military order or something like that. And it's not the case, for example, with the new ruling elite in the post-communist regimes, or now I concentrate on the form of patron autocracy, where you have the monopoly of power. And it's also not a new class because the classes are characterized by impersonal relations, where only your economic position and your relation to the means of production, whether you have or not, decides your position in the society, while the new elite, new ruling elite in a patron autocracy has patronal personal ties and personal type of subordinations to each other in this society. So therefore we introduced a new category, the so-called adapted political family, to describe this new ruling elite, which means that different networks of extended personal acquaintance are organized into a single adapted political family. And this adapted political family is nothing else like a political economic clan. It has a clan structure, which means that not only individuals, like for example in the nomenclatura of the communist times, but complete families are incorporated into the ruling elite. And contrary to the nomenclatura, it does not mean that all persons in this new ruling elite should have a formal membership or formal position in this ruling elite, but there is an informal. There are informal positions, informal ties within it. So it means that it extends over the formal institutions, and contrary to the communist regimes, it's not based on organizational loyalty, but a patronal one. The members of the ruling elite of the adapted political family have to be loyal to the chief patron, to the so-called godfather. And this means at the same time, as I mentioned before, that it's a combination of formal and informal positions within this ruling elite that does not converge necessarily your position within the adapted political family with the formal administrative positions in in public administration or in public authorities. And as an adapted political family, as a clan, it combines at the same time the political and economic resources in this adapted political family. And this clan structure resembles very much of the patriarchal family, where the head of the family not governs as a prime minister or a president in a constitutional regime, but disposes over statuses, members, properties, incomes, revenues, etc., etc. It's going on. So the next question is that if we already define this ruling elite and at the top of this ruling elite, we can find a closer minor circle of the chief patron's court, including persons with formal and informal positions. The question is that what is their relation to the power? And it's nothing else that it's a private appropriation of public authority, but it's the way as this appropriation is going on is nothing else than a kind of patronalization of the institutions. When we use the term, even for some types of democracies, patronal democracy, or for some types of autocracies, patron autocracy, it means that these institutions are patronalized. The term patronal was coined by Henry Hale, a professor of the George Washington University, and we have to distinguish 4 dimensions if we want somehow to measure whether a regime to what extent is patronalized or not. The first dimension is that where, in the case of institutions, where are the major decisions are taken, whether they are formal institutions where these decisions are made or informal ones. And if they are informal ones, then this regime is much more patronal. So when we try to apply the mainstream politology, the language of mainstream politology for description of post-communist regimes, and we start sentences like that this party or party leadership decided about this, the parliament decided about that, the government decided about a third thing. These are false sentences because they just hide the real existence of an informal power around the chief patron, which is a combination, as I mentioned, of formal and informal positions. The decisions are made not in formal institutions. These formal institutions just rubber stamp the decisions made outside of them. The next dimension is the question that whether the regulations, meaning the laws or decrees, are normative ones or discretional ones, which means custom tailored to reward the cronies or to punish the enemies or illoyal institutions, persons, etc. in this system. And we see that in the case of patron autocracies, these laws are much more custom tailored and in style discretional ones. Again, the question is the third one that whether corporate or collective bodies are taking these decisions or these are just tied to single persons, and whether the exercise of the power is much more personal one. In these patron autocracies is much more personal one. And finally, that the hierarchy within the society is commuted through bureaucratic institutional chains or just clientelist personal chains. And the bigger is the degree of moving these dimensions toward informal ones, discretional, personal, clientelist, personal chains, then we can say that this regime is much more patronal. The next question is, which relates that what happens with the property and the revenues within this system. And here we have to make a very important distinction, because the analysts used to make a separation between capitalist and socialist systems, while they identify the capitalist system necessarily with market economy. And in such a way, they face a lot of troubles and difficulties how to define the economic relations within some of these post-communist regimes, or even in a wider degree in hybrid regimes. Therefore, we introduced a new category of the category of relational economy, and we set up a model in which the socialist system, the old communist system, is characterized by planned or command economy, where, using the terms of Karl Polanyi, the economy is embedded one, but bureaucratically embedded in the situation, and the form of bureaucratical embeddedness is commuted through the nomenclatura, formal nomenclatura, what we were speaking before. But in the case of a capitalist system, you can find a socially, politically disembedded economy where it was a long historical process for centuries, while in Western Europe the economy became disembedded and separated from other spheres of social actions, while in some post-communist regimes, after the collapse of the communist rule, we can find a patronally embedded economy. So, using again the dominant integration, investigating that which are the dominant integration schemes or coordinating mechanism of these societies, where Karl Polanyi set up the three major types. The reciprocity, we do not take care now for this form of coordinating mechanism, but the redistribution and market coordination, these are the two major things what we investigate. The question is that what is the role of redistribution in this capitalist system of some of these regimes, and therefore we made a difference between bureaucratic resource redistribution, which is formalized, impersonal, normative, and general one, totalitarian one for communist regimes, and then other type of redistribution, the relational market redistribution, which is non-formalized, personal, discretional, and dominant one. So the question is not that whether these are the only coordinating mechanism in a society or not, because even Karl Polanyi says that reciprocity, redistribution, and market coordination are all the time present simultaneously, practically in all regimes since centuries. The question is that which is the dominant form. What we say that in some post-communist regimes, the dominant coordinating mechanism, in spite of the fact that they are capitalist system, not the market coordination, but the relational market redistribution, in which regimes the invisible hand of impersonal market forces is replaced by the very visible hand of the chief patrons who interferes with the market forces. And now let's go to the next question in this relation, that what does it mean, the chief patron's visible hand, and what does it mean, that relational economy? It means that in these societies, what is, for example, patron autocracies within the EU, Hungary is the only one. Beyond the EU, Russia and Central Asian countries can be put in this box of patron autocracies. Those who has the monopoly of political power, they do not govern, but of course they dispose over positions, as I mentioned, but not only positions and over the taxes what they gather through formal mechanism from the economy, but on the other hand they disposes over the properties of others, and the form of this disposal is can be very similar to a process of predation, which has three phases: the stalking phase, the hunting phase, and the consuming phase. And it means that in the stalking phase, those who has real power for that, those whom we call oligarchs, for example, in this regime, and at the top of this hierarchy is the chief patron, they just try to hand down enterprises or even complete branches of the economy which were originally independent from the ruling elite, and then they try to estimate that how can they destroy the economic or legal position of these enterprises with the help of illegitimate state coercion, and to estimate at the same time that if they seize this property, what could be their forecasted value, meaning using their corruption capacity to enrich through corruption transactions with the ownership of the given property. And so after the stalking phase is coming the hunting phase, using several agencies of state coercion and the state apparatus, including the parliament, the government, the different controlling institutions, tax offices, chief attorney's offices, etc., etc. And the third phase is the consuming phase, when they practically seize that property. Then of course, with their relational network, where the resources of political resources and economic resources are converging, they can maximize their properties. So, but when we are speaking about these possibilities, we have to examine the legality. What is the legality of these type of actions? And if we consider the legality, then we have to make a difference between different levels of corruption and to what extent a state can be corrupt, which means that what is the amplitude of arbitrariness, what they use as a state coercion. When we are speaking about corrupt state, then we have to make a difference between endemic corruption and systemic corruption. Endemic corruption means when the corruption transactions are very widespread, but it's mainly restricted to the bottom-up type of corruptions, the the petty corruptions, and in such corrupt transactions, a representative of a public authority has relatively limited possibility to get involved into such a corrupt transactions, because the capacity in which he or she can become corrupt is limited to his small positions. In the case when we are speaking about capture state, it means that different oligarchic force or criminal groups are capturing certain segments of the state bureaucracy, let it be local governments, a ministry, a special project or something like that, but still not the whole power, whole network of power or whole governance. But in the case of criminal state, we can say that the state is operated as a whole, as a criminal organization, in which in this hunting process, what about I was speaking before, they can combine the resources of the parliament, the government, the controlling organizations and other organizations, chief attorney's office, etc., together, and to create a monopolize practically the corruption. And in patron autocracies like Hungary, Russia, Central Asian countries, we can say that these regimes do not have governments, they have criminal organizations in the positions of the monopoly of political power. And now if we turn to the next slide, then we can see the difference of within the different levels of corruption. I won't tell everything what you can see here, but when we are speaking about the petty corruption, the free market, it means a free market corruption, that it's a voluntary transaction of non-centralized mechanism within a corruption transactions, and it's a competitive one. This is why we say that it's you can freely enter in a free market corruption, a corruption transaction, and compete with other partners in it. And it's occasional, partial, even if you can repeat it if you want. And from this petty corruption, you can go to other levels of corruption. And at the end of this scale, you can find the criminal state pattern, the real grand corruption, which is coercive, centralized, monopolistic. It's a vertical top-down, and creates permanent and general vessel chains within the society. And now, if we take into consideration this, what is the essence of these 4 dimensions, if we can tell that if we want to define a regime referring to the actor of the to the political and economic power, and we can say that it's a clan state, or if we refer to the action of these of this actor targeting the power, namely the private expropriation of public authority, and we can say that it's a neo-patrimonial state, which is a Max Weberian category. Or if we speak about its relation to the property of others or to the property of public, and we say that it's a predatory state. And if we, under fourth dimension, we refer to the legality of this power, criminal state. These statements, of course, they are all valid ones, but these statements, clan state, now patrimonial, predatory, and criminal state, they refer to different dimensions of a single regime. But if a regime fulfills all these criteria, then we can speak about mafia state. And of course, not only post-communist states can be mafia states within the hybrid regimes, but we were investigating the post-communist regimes now, because it was much more easily available and comparable for us. And we can say that as I mentioned, within the EU Hungary and beyond the EU Russia and the Central Asian former Soviet republics are those who within the regime types of patron autocracies represent post-communist mafia states. And now I hand over the floor to my friend Bálint, who continues now with the regime trajectories.
All right, thank you very much. So far, Bálint was talking about mafia state, and in particular, when he showed you the triangle diagram, and he talked about the doubling of democracy, autocracy, and dictatorship, so that we have two democracies, two autocracies, and two dictatorships. The mafia state belongs to a form of autocracy, in particular to patronal autocracy. But as Bálint already said, not all the post-communist countries have reached that situation of patronal autocracy. Indeed, there are various regime trajectories, and within this triangle, we can actually model the various development trajectories of these countries, and we can analyze what paths they followed after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Here, we have to distinguish between primary trajectories and secondary trajectories. Primary trajectories are the first stop. They represent the first stop after the end of the communist regime. There were some countries where the presumption of transitology that Bálint was talking about in the beginning, that they had this illusion that the countries would move toward liberal democracy. Well, some of the countries did move toward liberal democracy. Some of the countries, like Estonia, but even Poland and Hungary in the 1990s, they changed from communist dictatorship to liberal democracy. Or if I want to speak in more concrete terms, what this meant for the regime, they changed from the single pyramid bureaucratic patronal system to a multi-pyramid non-patronal system. Now, there were other countries like Romania or Ukraine, which never became liberal democracies. They never became liberal democracies. They became patronal democracies. This means that they changed from single pyramid to multi-pyramid systems. So the system where there was one power center and one power vertical, the communist dictatorship, that was dissolved into a multi-pyramid setting where there are multiple power centers, competing power centers, but these are, it's a multi-pyramid informal patronal system. Now, the third type of primary trajectory that could be observed mainly in Central Asian countries like Kazakhstan, where they changed from one single pyramid setting to the other, from communist dictatorship to patronal autocracy, from single pyramid bureaucratic patronal system to the single pyramid informal patronal system. And finally, there is the type of trajectory that's not even a regime change, but rather a model change. It's a model change because it represents a change within the type of dictatorship, from communist dictatorship to market exploiting dictatorship. We see this in the case of China, where there were the two major features of communist dictatorship, one-party system and the monopoly of state ownership. And they kept the one-party system, but allowed other types of ownership to exist. And this created an interesting dynamics of various coordinating mechanisms, including actually the bureaucratic resource distribution, market coordination, and the relational market redistribution that Bálint was talking about in a very interesting mixture. This is what we describe as market exploiting dictatorship. Now let's move on to the secondary trajectories. If the primary trajectories were the first stop, the secondary trajectories are the second stop. What happens after the countries already reach some sort of situation after the regime change? Here we can see different patterns of democratic backsliding. Democratic backsliding moving away from the types of democracy, from liberal democracy or patronal democracy. In the case of Poland, after 2015, we saw that under Jarosław Kaczynski, under the rulership of Jarosław Kaczynski, the country experienced a conservative autocratic attempt. A conservative autocratic attempt. This meant that if we analyze the regime on these two levels, multi-pyramid, non-patronal, or whether it's single or multi-pyramid or non-patronal or informal patronal, we could see that there was an attempt to change one of these levels, to change the multi-pyramid non-patronal system into a single pyramid non-patronal system, namely from liberal democracy to conservative autocracy. This meant that Kaczynski focused only on monopolizing political power, but he wanted to use that power to implement an ideology, not to patronize the economy or to carry out that kind of predation, for example, that Bálint was talking about, taking away companies and giving them to the loyal members of the adopted political family. In the case of the Czech Republic, we saw the inverse. We saw the inverse. There, the multi-pyramid nature of the system was preserved, but the non-patronal character was attempted to be changed to an informal patronal character. So there was an attempt to change the Czech Republic under Babiš, under the rule of Babiš, from liberal democracy to patronal democracy, from multi-pyramid non-patronal system to a multi-pyramid informal patronal system. Now, these two attempts I mentioned, Kaczynski in Poland and Babiš in the Czech Republic, they were defeated. Well, the example for the third attempt has not been defeated, and that is Viktor Orbán in Hungary. There he changed both levels. He changed from multi-pyramid non-patronal system to a single pyramid informal patronal system. This is probably the longest trajectory here, changing from liberal democracy to patronal autocracy. Finally, we see in the case of Russia that the country, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, became a regime that resembled mainly patronal democracy. Actually, in our book, this Anatomy of Post-Communist Regimes that was showed in the beginning, we call the 1990s Russia an oligarchic anarchy. But still, it resembles a patronal democracy on these two levels, because it was a multi-pyramid setting. There were multiple power centers, and it was informal patronal with strong oligarchic structures. But then Putin came along and changed this setting from the multi-pyramid competitive informal patronal system to a single pyramid informal patronal system. Now, I would like to turn to the case of Ukraine and the war and the effect of the war on all these structures. And what we have to see if we observe the trajectory of Ukraine within this triangle, that it doesn't really fit those nice one and two ways of primary trajectories and secondary trajectories that I just showed you. Rather, in the case of Ukraine, we see a pendulum-like movement between patronal democracy and patronal autocracy. So after the regime change, as I mentioned, the country didn't become a liberal democracy. It became a patronal democracy. But there were several attempts to change this, mainly under Presidents Leonid Kuchma and Viktor Yanukovych. There were attempts to change the system and to institute autocracy. But these attempts, these autocratic attempts, were defeated in the so-called color revolutions. However, the color revolutions did not bring liberal democracy. They only allowed the country to return to patronal democracy. So this is what we call regime cycles that you can see now in this triangle. Now, if you want to understand this, if you want to understand this dynamic, so why in the case of Ukraine, we can see that the country didn't become patronal autocracy, but it couldn't become liberal democracy either. If we want to understand this, we have to understand the category of patronal democracy a little bit closer. Now, as Bálint already mentioned, the main difference between a liberal democracy and a patronal democracy is this. In a liberal democracy, there is party competition. In patronal democracy, there is also party competition, but it is in fact the competition of informal patron-client networks. This means that there are multiple adopted political families. There are multiple informal patronal networks. If what we see on the surface is party competition with various ideologies, left-wing, right-wing, conservatives, liberals, whatever. But in fact, these are cover ideologies, and the parties themselves are cover organizations of the informal networks. Now, each informal network, each adopted political family has a twin motive, the twin motive of power concentration and wealth accumulation. Now, with these motives, if any of them gets into power, what will it try to do? It will try to maximize its power and to maximize its access to state resources. So when they get into power, when one of them wins the elections, immediately will try to break down the system. It will immediately try to push out everyone else from the state machinery. It will try to maximize its own access to state resources and to try to consolidate its own power, practically to become the dominant network, and subjugate, marginalize, or eliminate all the competitors. So all of the networks want to break pluralism. All the networks want to change from multi-pyramid informal patronal system to a single pyramid informal patronal system. This is why we say that while in a liberal democracy, legitimacy challenge is an anomaly, in a patronal democracy, it is the norm. Democracy is always in danger because all of the participants separately, so each of the participants, they want to break democracy down. All the major players want to break democracy down. However, what we saw in the case of Ukraine is that nobody has been able to do that. Nobody has been able to do that because even though the ruling network tried, the opposition networks were too strong. And also there was a strong and vibrant civil society. And those two together, the opposition networks and the civil society, they could prevent the autocratic breakthrough. So if we look at the various levels of autocratic change, we can say that there were autocratic attempts, but never autocratic breakthrough, let alone autocratic consolidation, which would be the third phase. And therefore, these autocratic changes, these could be reversed in Ukraine by electoral means or extra electoral means, by which, of course, I mean the color revolutions. However, the problem is the following. Western observers were very optimistic about the color revolutions. And why is that? That is because they were thinking in the democracy-dictatorship axis. The democracy-dictatorship axis, their idea of regimes was that there is a single axis between democracy and dictatorship. And if you look at the color revolutions on that single axis, then what do you see? Then you saw that there was a regime that was closer to the dictatorial pole, and now that is defeated, then the country must move towards the freer pole. Therefore, it must move towards liberal democracy. Everyone assumed that in the West that the color revolutions are now finally bringing the country closer to liberal democracy. However, if we reject this single axis explanation, if we reject that and we introduce the triangle explanation instead, then we have to see that under the surface of political competition, there are informal patronal networks. And then we have to see that even though the ruling network was defeated, the opposition networks remained. And if the opposition networks remained, then in the next elections, another one gets into power and it once again tries to break down the system. And it gets defeated again, another one gets into power, once again tries to break down the system, and so on and so forth. So there are always democratic transformations, but never anti-patronal transformation. There are always attempts to change from the multi-pyramid setting, where there are multiple networks, multiple power centers, that between them, there is a room for maneuver for civil society. They always try to change this, the ruling network, into the single pyramid model, but it is never successful. It is defeated, but then the system only goes back to square one, to the business as usual of patronal democracy. Now, in Ukraine, after the second color revolution, which was the Euromaidan revolution in 2013, or as the Ukrainians like to call it, the revolution of dignity, we saw an anti-patronal attempt. an anti-patronal attempt, meaning an attempt to finally break out of these regime cycles. This attempt involved three things. First, it involved civil society and the activation and increasing role of civil society in local and national governance. So what we actually saw is that finally the people wanted to have a seat at the table. And there was a real spread of and emergence and abundance of new NGOs and organizations all over Ukraine, mainly anti-corruption organizations, and they had such initiatives that actually had a very, very positive anti-patronal effect on national and local governance. So that is one point. The second is that there was a decentralization reform in 2014 that empowered local governments vis-a-vis the central government. And that, once again, was an attempt of anti-patronal or a part of an anti-patronal attempt. And finally, the agenda of anti-patronal transformation was elevated to the rank of central politics when Zelensky was elected in 2019. So Zelensky is the first post-communist president of Ukraine who is not a chief patron himself. That he doesn't have his own adopted political family. He is not the leader or the godfather of an adopted political family. Rather, he posed a challenge. He posed a challenge to the patronal element of the system. And together with civil society, they tried to challenge this patronal element of Ukraine's patronal democracy. Now, before the full-scale invasion, this was an open question: which side is winning? Which side is winning, the patronal side or the anti-patronal side? Even if the president wants to eliminate such structures, we call these structures stubborn structures. And this means that there are a lot of people, oligarchs, and a lot of others who have stakes in the game, and they have very high stakes and very much a lot of investments in this structure, and they don't want to let it just to be demolished. So it was a fight between these sides. Now, what do we see with the invasion? With the invasion, we see that it really tipped the balance in the favor of the anti-patronal forces. So we see that the patronal forces, the oligarchs, are weakening, and the anti-patronal forces are strengthening. The patronal forces, the oligarchs, lose a lot of their wealth, they lose a lot of their markets, and they lose a lot of their connections, mainly to Russia. And on the other hand, we see that the state goes to war mode. And when the state goes to war mode, that means that there is power centralization. When there is power centralization, that means that Zelensky has more power and more political resources in his hand. And he uses those resources to crack down on the oligarchs, to try to break these patronal structures. So we see that now, finally, an anti-patronal transformation is ongoing. In the case of Ukraine, it is trying to break out of these regime cycles finally. However, there is still a problem. And the problem is that what is Zelensky doing right now? He centralizes power and he neutralizes the oligarchs. Now, what did Putin do back in the early 2000s? He centralized power and neutralized the oligarchs. So, are they doing something similar? Is it, I can also ask, is it true what I was just telling you, that Zelensky is really trying to break these oligarchic structures and tries to move the country to liberal democracy? Or rather, he just achieves what none of his predecessors could achieve, namely to really create the single pyramid network, to finally subjugate, eliminate, or marginalize all the competitors and become the real chief patron of a patronal autocracy. So which is true? Which one is true? Is he creating an autocracy or finally an anti-patronal liberal democracy? Now, with Bálint, we have a new edited volume, which is also being translated to Spanish, actually, and will be published by Hypermedia, about the Russia-Ukraine war and the structural consequences. And in this volume, with mainly Ukrainian authors, we try to analyze this question as well and what is happening. And what we found very briefly is that Zelensky is not doing the same what Putin did in the early 2000s. There are some similarities. Zelensky's power network is a single pyramid power network that he is now leading. It is a pyramid-like hierarchy. There is personal loyalty of his clients. There is an increasing power of the president, and there is a decreasing power of the parliament. All of these features can be found in Zelensky, and they can be found in patron autocracies. They can be found in mafia states like Hungary and Russia. So in these four things, they are very similar. But there are major dissimilarities. And if I want to summarize them now, I would say that what we do not see in the case of Zelensky, what we do not see is that he would use state power for predation, for central-led corporate trading that Bálint was describing. He is not creating a new oligarchy, and he is not becoming an oligarch himself. We saw these three features with the previous presidents in Ukraine, and they were patronal presidents, Kuchma, Yanukovych. They had all these predation, creating new oligarchy, and a loyal oligarchy, and being or becoming oligarchs themselves. In the case of Zelensky, we do not see any of these. And this indicates that his network is really not a patronal network, that he is not a patronal president, that what he leads is a bureaucratic single pyramid network and not an informal patronal network. Now, the question remains, and this is my final slide, the question remains is in which direction will Ukraine go after the war? So what I was arguing so far only meant that the country is not going towards patronal autocracy. Okay, it is going up or upward in the triangle, and is trying to break out of the regime cycles. Okay, but upward in which direction? The problem is, or the paradox here, is the opposite of what Ukraine had during the regime cycles. If you remember, I said that in the regime cycles, there were always democratic transformations, but never anti-patronal. Now there is anti-patronal transformation, but will there be democratic? Will there be democratic? Will this single pyramid network of Zelensky fall apart after the war, and therefore there will be anti-patronal and democratic transformation, moving the country towards liberal democracy? Or the single pyramid remains, and then the country moves towards conservative autocracy? This is what we will have to see after the war ends. And in this book, and also in the Anatomy of Post-Communist Regimes, of course, we do not have the exact answer to what is going on. What we really try to give, or what we really try to offer, and what we are trying to offer now, is a language, an analytical category, a set of category, a toolkit, if you will, which you can use to tell these stories meaningfully, and to identify the factors that are affecting the story, and therefore to try to understand what is really going on and what we have to focus on when we try to analyze these regimes and are pondering about their future. Thank you very much for your attention. And now I will stop sharing.
Well, thank you, Bálint Magyar. Thank you, Bálint Medlovic. Leo?
Armando, ¿me oyes?
Yes. Well, I have the first question, but I'm friend of Bálint, and maybe another one will have some ideas, question anyway.
Perdona, Armando, primero vamos a cerrar la transmisión. Agradecerles a los profesores Bálint Magyar y Bálint Medlovic todo el tiempo que nos han dedicado, sus conocimientos, su análisis. Y bueno, invitar a quienes nos siguen vía redes sociales a que escuchen el próximo encuentro, que va a ser sobre autoritarismos competitivos, con la doctora Marisabel Puerta. Que tengan muy buenas tardes para quienes nos siguen desde América Latina, y muy buenas noches para quienes nos escuchan de Europa. Esperamos unos minutos.
Yes, Bálint, we are